My bangs are cut, I've got a bug bite on my face, and I'm here to cause some more controversy. The world is a dumpster fire, and here's even more bad news to add to it. Hey everyone, so this is going to be a bit more of an impromptu video since I am suddenly able to come back from hiatus, much to some people's disappointment. I am now finally able to post after, 12 weeks I think, of not being able to. Basically, I live in a small town where there's a lot of Fox News watchers, and I thought it probably wasn't going to be super safe to try to upload at the library while this whole coronavirus thing is going on. But now I have access to a cafe where people know me and don't think that I'm going to kill them all with my diseases, so here we are. So once again, we are going to discuss a more serious topic. This week, we are going to talk about baby Huxley. To those who don't know, there's a YouTuber, I believe her name is Huxley Stauffer, Micah, I'm gonna just say Micah for this. She adopted a little boy from China and now has decided she doesn't want him anymore, so she has gotten rid of him. And as an adoptee from China, I decided that this is a topic that I am both an expert on and also should comment on. When I was scrolling down my YouTube feed on this subject, it seemed like most of the people talking about it were just like adoptive moms, mostly white women, which is fine because I think it's really good that people are talking about it, but I figure I might as well put my perspective in as somebody who has experienced adoption. I studied a certain amount of psychology, and also I have relatives who suffer from autism, so I also have an understanding of that situation. So let's start with the obvious. That never should have happened. He has been severely exploited and used, and then discarded when he was no longer wanted. And that is the worst thing that can happen to any child, let alone one who has a disability. I can only imagine that the feelings of insufficiency and nothingness can only double and triple when abandoned twice. I could probably talk for hours about the Stauffer family and whether or not they should have been given Huxley in the first place. But frankly, I'm pretty sure anything that I could possibly say about the way that Huxley has been used has already been said. So I'm not going to. As an adoptee from China, I do have an understanding of the kind of trauma that abandonment causes, because although I've lived with the same family my entire life, there is a element of it that follows you through everything. I can't speak for other people I know, but there are certain feelings that will follow you that way. There are feelings of not being wanted and never being enough, never fitting in with the family that you do live with, which was part of the case with Huxley. He was treated differently, I gather, from his other siblings, and you could call it because he had a disability, or you could always say that it was because he was adopted, he was Chinese, he wasn't the same as the other children. And maybe it was all of those reasons, but I understand that particular feeling of not belonging that tends to come with adoption and being raised by a white family. So through a lot of different sources, I have a pretty good understanding of child development and a certain amount of understanding of neuroscience, and that is the perspective I wanted to discuss right now about the situation. And so first I want to take a minute to sit down and talk about how development is affected by living in an orphanage. And this is before you factor in that he also suffered from autism. This is just, first off, how it affects anybody. Back in about 2010, I went back to my own orphanage, which is where I got a lot of this information. Alright, when I went to my Chinese orphanage, it was technically not the actual building I came from. They were in the process of rebuilding a new one, so they, in the meantime, had moved the entire orphanage to like this hospital thing or some other, like this tall building next door, which was a lot more grim and clinical than the real orphanage tends to look. Basically, the orphanages are like a series of rooms, and each of these rooms contains some number of the Chinese orphans. So there's like one area that will be for the infants, and essentially this room, from my knowledge, is like a big room that's just filled with cribs. The babies stay in the cribs for pretty much all of the day. It's not necessarily that they're neglected, because the caregivers who work there do everything they can to care for us. I think that's something that a lot of people don't understand about this orphan situation. The people who are appointed to take care of us really do care about us and what happens to us. The problem is, much like overcrowding, there's just so many people, so many babies that need to be cared for, that as a result, we just don't really get a lot out of it, developmentally speaking. Caregivers are each appointed to a certain number of children. So say like it's 5 per caregiver as an example. So as you can probably imagine, it's very hard to keep track of 5 infants, and that's what has to happen. So don't blame any of this on the people who are directly taking care of us. They want us to survive and to thrive. They want us to find a good home and to be cared for. It's just something that they personally cannot do. Moving on from that, there is then another room where the toddlers go. And this is the only other room of orphans that I got to see. There was a room for toddlers, and it was this bigger room, I think maybe, than the one with the cribs in it, and they just had like, say, I don't know, 15, 20 toddlers in there, and they were all just kind of like running around and playing and just kind of doing their own thing in that room. The point still being that not very often do they get to really be attended to. And the question is, how does this affect our development? Because that is what I wanted to talk about. Basically, because these children are left alone for such long periods of time, we tend to get a little stunted in our development process mentally. All of us were about 1 year old when we were adopted. Because we were sitting in cribs for pretty much the entire day, we didn't get that cognitive development that infants and babies need when they're small. Babies immediately understand a certain amount of language. They cannot speak it because their mouths and muscles movement is not developed enough for them to be able to form the shapes that are required to make words. But for a long time, they will understand what people are saying to them. I personally didn't know how to crawl. I couldn't stand. I couldn't obviously walk. I was very behind in that regard. According to my parents, I was always quite mentally sharp in the language area, in that when they were speaking English to me, obviously I didn't really get it for a while. It took me probably about 2 months or so to start understanding English. So I had a very good understanding of what people were saying to me, but I couldn't really physically do anything. So there are definitely ways that Chinese orphans are behind other children their same age, and I can imagine that can only be complicated even further for people like baby Huxley, who also happen to suffer from autism. I wouldn't know specifically how. I haven't watched the videos with him in it, since I did not want to contribute to the views that would be on them. Essentially, he'd probably have very similar issues to the rest of us, and then another layer of issues on top of that that have to do with his disability. Another thing that I wanted to discuss when it comes to Chinese adoption is the attachment issues that some to many of the orphans will have because they were abandoned. Again, I can only probably speak from mainly my own experience on this particular subject, but I know that is something that can be deeply impacted based on child development, because newborns can only see about 6 inches from their face. So the distance that their face is from yours when you cradle them, that is the whole distance that they can see. Obviously, that's not the case once they begin to grow, but the point being that their vision really is limited to their primary caregiver. So if their caregiver changes, or their primary caregiver from the first few months leaves, it really creates a lasting impression on the baby. For example, me and some of my other Chinese sisters, we all had issues with thumb sucking, or finger sucking, or hand sucking. And it went on for quite a while for, I know, quite a few of us. We were doing it for a long time, and the reason for that, I have kind of deduced, is that it's an attachment thing. Our fingers or our hands were always there, so therefore they were the thing that we became very attached to when it came to looking for ways to calm ourselves. Obviously, this would cause some social problems down the road, but that is beside the point. I just wanted to pick apart some of how being alone for so much time affects us. I know in my situation, and I would imagine probably in baby Huxley's, that he probably became very attached to his new parents. When I was first adopted, I was handed to my mother, and I grabbed onto her, and I wouldn't let go. I imagine that was probably a similar situation for baby Huxley, but for him, it's even worse. Not just because of his disability, but also because he was 2 years old when he was given to his family, which means he probably had a certain amount of memory of that point in time. And now that he's being abandoned, He is 4 years old, which means he will have even more memories of this abandonment. Many of us are lucky enough not to remember being abandoned. He may not have memory of the first time he was actually abandoned, but he will remember when he was first leaving the orphanage to go to his first family. And being abandoned again at 4 years old, he is definitely going to remember, and I think it's going to probably scar him for the rest of his life. There are a lot of complications involved with autism, and I do not know how severe his case was. However, I have 2 relatives, one who has Asperger's and another who is extremely severely autistic, and I do have an understanding of how it affects them. My cousin, who suffers from very severe autism, is extremely attached to her mother. She needs her for basically everything. She can do a lot of things by herself, but she's extremely attached. I am a relative that she is quite close to, so she will follow me around, and I would assume Huxley is probably very similar. So between these 2 different things, one being because he is an orphan and was looking for attachment, and then that he also is suffering from autism, there's a good chance that he really did latch on to his new mother, and being abandoned by her is probably the worst thing that could possibly happen to him. Being treated differently while raised in an all-white family is already damaging enough, but it can only be made worse by what's happened to him now. And although I'm not a person who probably should give too much input on the topic of family planning, as a single girl who does not want a family, having a baby while trying to learn how to handle Huxley was irresponsible. After the newest baby was born, Huxley didn't matter anymore, as if because their youngest child is broken, they need another. It almost feels as if they wanted to replace him. Adopting a child is the same amount of responsibility as giving birth to one yourself. Children with autism deserve love and patience and respect. They do not deserve everything that Huxley has experienced. Being an orphan from China is hard enough as it is. He did not need this to make it harder. Okay, I think I'm probably done rambling about this. I just felt that as someone who was adopted from China, I have a different and deeper understanding of this, and it felt important for me as someone who has experienced adoption to speak up about this. So thank you so much for watching. I'll see you next week.